incredible source of data that are there and available in most countries, household consumption and expenditure surveys, and give people a few ideas about how they can use them to answer nutrition questions. And I know that there's some people I see in the room who already use these types of data for nutrition analysis. So really just start this discussion, connect with others who use these type of data. I think that there are a lot of us out there. There are a lot of people that maybe could make better use of these data. And I think there's a lot to be gained from connecting. And then we're going to have some policy reflections on how these data are being used in countries to answer questions about micronutrient policy and programs, or how they could be used. So we're looking forward to getting into this with you. Just a little bit of an introduction. Once again, I don't know how much we need to go through these backgrounds when we're here at a conference through mostly nutrition-focused people, but we're kind of zooming in here now on micronutrients. So we're talking about things that could threaten population health and development. I think we really want to underline that focusing on micronutrients, even if you have not such a high wasting or stunting prevalence in a country, is still incredibly important for the growth, the well-being of individuals and their families, but also the development of a country. There are two main areas that we can choose for interventions to do something about inadequate micronutrient intake or micronutrient deficiencies within a country. One would be improving the quality of diets overall. So I've put a couple of different, sorry, I just realized I'm blocking you. A couple of different large actions that can be taken place here. Biofortification, large-scale food fortification, but also including making nutritious foods more accessible through social protection programs, market and value chain approaches, and then anything that do with taxes, improving access, reducing prices, levers within the system to improve access to nutritious foods. And then we can also focus on, thank you so much, the most vulnerable in their society, and really making sure that they are reached with nutritious foods. So that could be targeted supplementation as well, more of a medical approach, school meals and early childhood, and making sure there's nutritious foods within these, primary healthcare services, and community health outreach programs. All of these types of programs are going to need some sort of information to inform their design. It could be informing what you do, what sort of entry points, who you target, and the specifics of what goes into those programs as well. Maybe it's the standards, the micronutrient levels within a fortified food or a fortified product. Maybe it's just working out the sort of levels of eligibility for a certain program. So the types of data we could look at could be the magnitude and distribution of malnutrition from biomarkers or really sort of any type of anthropometry surveys. Dietary data, looking at the likelihood that people are consuming diets that meet their micronutrient needs. The coverage and consumption of foods that are fortified or should be fortified or could be fortified in a community. And then the impact and effectiveness of different programs. And this is where we get up to where we are now in 2025. Before 2025, it was already not looking good for these types of data. There really not a lot of national micronutrient surveys in the types of countries that we are working in. If they do happen, then I think a country is lucky if they have a survey every 5 years. They cost a lot of money, they take a lot of capacity, and that was before the funding cuts of this year. So we're really looking at this sort of really big situation of data scarcity. I think that everybody in this room is an advocate for collecting these types of data. We are not for 1 minute suggesting here that we should just forget about it and not advocate for micronutrient data collection. But in the meantime, until we get better data collection, we're talking about what you could do in the interim. So we're really talking about filling gaps with other types of data sources. So kind of going back to this in a different way, you have a few different options for using data for nutrition decisions. And what we have here, if I can, no, I don't know if I have a pointer, but on the left axis, on the y-axis, you have the strength and precision of evidence, but then on the x-axis, you have the feasibility and availability of these data. So biomarkers is an obvious one here, urinary iodine, anything to do with collecting the amount of micronutrients in blood to work out if there are deficiencies. That's not something we might have access to in the next few years, depending on where you are. So your next kind of item there, something that might be a little bit easier, but still quite a lot of capacity to collect, is individual dietary intake data from 24-hour recalls. And then the next area is where we come along to household consumption and expenditure surveys. So we're going to talk a little bit more about these, but these are nationally representative economic surveys that most countries conduct regularly. And they can be used because they've got information about all of the individual foods consumed at the household level. They can be used to estimate food and micronutrient intake for individuals. You can even keep going down to any types of proxy data, food balance sheets that you could use either to predict or estimate micronutrient availability in a country. But really just to say there's quite a lot of options out there, and just because you don't have one right now, it doesn't mean you can't use another one in the interim. So next, we're going to focus a little bit on household consumption surveys. So as we said before, there's some people in this room that we know that already use household consumption and expenditure surveys to do nutrition analysis. These are nationally representative surveys that are used to collect information on usually the economic situation of the country to be able to set national policy levels, poverty lines. They will include usually a household consumption component that includes all of the foods that that household consumed or purchased over the last 7 or 14 days. The food lists are generally between 100 to 250 items long, so they can be very detailed, and you can match those foods to food composition information and then do some analysis that Gabrielle will talk you through to redistribute the household level consumption so you have an estimate not only of how much each household member eats, but how adequate that consumption is. The benefits of using these data, they already exist. You don't need to go and collect them. In most countries, they're publicly available or through a partnership with the Department of Census and Statistics or your National Statistics Agency, you can get access to them with an agreement. They're nationally representative. You can usually disaggregate your data down to the district level, sort of admin level 1 or 2, depending on your country. They include a lot of other data that you can use to disaggregate your estimates by. You can have household wealth quintiles, you can have education status, you can have housing quality, and so forth, educational attainment. So they're really rich data. You just need to make a few different conversions. We are not by any means the first group to do this work. I think IFPRI was some of the first around the early 2010s to start really publishing about using these types of data for nutrition analysis. What we really want to get across is that we know it's a new concept for a lot of people, but there's a lot of science now proving that it's a pretty good proxy. Obviously, again, not as precise as the other sources that we talked through before, but in the absence of those, it's something that you can do to make some estimates and then triangulate as much as you can. So the type of evidence that you can generate using these types of data, you can estimate the consumption of food, food groups, and micronutrients and macronutrients per adult female equivalent, which is taking the adult woman as the most vulnerable household member so that you have a good idea of sort of would the needs of the most vulnerable in the community be met using this micronutrient intake. You can then explore what the diets look like in a country, where are micronutrients coming from, what are the sources of micronutrients. And you can estimate the risk that the intake of micronutrients within a country is inadequate. You can estimate the reach and per capita consumption of different foods that may be of interest. And you can also then model different scenarios. So you could look at, for example, if we were to improve access to green leafy vegetables in a country, if school meal programs were provided and they were quite nutritious, what type of contribution could that make to reducing micronutrient inadequacy? If all of the millet consumed in a country were fortified, for example, what could that do to sort of shift these levers to improve intake? It really depends what the policy question for a country is before you sort of start then playing with different ideas there, and we'll go through that a little bit as well. And as I said before, all of this can be disaggregated by geography, socioeconomic status, other indicators that are in your data set. So I'm going to hand over to Gabrielle now to give a couple of examples from one analysis we ran in India, and then we'll open up for a bit of a discussion of ideas.
Thanks for Francis for kind of introducing the reason why we've and the background of using HCES. I'll be going through some examples that we've worked on in our team in India, and we'll be going through the kind of process of looking quite descriptively, then going more into detail about what policy questions are being asked. So the first example is what extent is micronutrient intake adequate subnationally, and who is the most vulnerable, and how do dietary patterns vary across the country. And through this, we looked at three main micronutrients that are focused on in the fortification program within the mandatory fortification guidelines in India. But we mapped the inadequacy across the country and saw that the inadequate intake varies geographically, with some states having a higher risk than others. We then wanted to look at the share of reported food group sources of micronutrient, both nationally and geographically by state. So we looked at the differences in what food groups were contributing to the intake, and saw in some states that it was very different to others. So in Rajasthan, for example, and Mizoram, we have very different sources of folate, iron, and B12, with B12 in Mizoram being mostly meats and fish, whereas in Rajasthan, mostly with milk. So we see that the risk of inadequate intake varies geographically, and programs are also adapted to local diet patterns, preferences. But what implications could this have for program implementation and impact? So to look at this, we looked at how geographically consumption of different food items took place. So here we use a kind of bivariate map, where on the x-axis we're looking at the coverage of a vehicle. So grey would be very low percentage of households consuming a vehicle, and blue would be a very high coverage, about between 75 and 100%. And on the y-axis we have the consumption per capita consumption of a vehicle. So yellow being high consumption, over 300 grams. And then on the square where we have green and kind of mix of colors, that indicates a both high coverage and high per capita consumption. And when we map this to PDS rice and PDS wheat, we see that we have very different consumption patterns across the country, with the east of the country and the south consuming having a very high coverage of rice consumption, but also in high quantities. Whereas for wheat, that we see a kind of opposite pattern, where in the west we have a high coverage, but sometimes lower coverage, but in high quantities. So this has real kind of implications for what a fortification program could do. So based on this, we had more questions around, we know that the rice through the public distribution system is fortified and it reaches over 6 million people. But could this be more effective at reducing micronutrient inadequacy? And how could we reduce inadequate intake in wheat-consuming states, for example? So for this, we looked at what would happen if we introduced higher standards for rice fortification. So on the left, we have the example where we have no fortification in the country, so none of the PDS rice, I'm imagining none of the PDS rice was fortified. And if we fortify to current Indian standards, we see a small reduction in the risk of inadequate intake, from 37% to 32% at current standards. And you see this slightly geographically, with some states going from a darker orange to a yellow. But when we look at modeling the PDS rice fortified to international standards, which for folate are more than 10 times higher than the current Indian standards, we see that the inadequate intake reduces a lot more to 23%, and with a clear difference in the color of inadequate intake on the maps, from kind of orange to blue across the PDS rice consuming states. We also wanted to look at what would happen if we fortified PDS wheat on top of rice, because we know that some states don't consume rice at all, based on our previous maps. And we saw nationally that this would have, again, a kind of modest reduction. So with current standards, it would reduce from a 25% reduction to a 28% reduction in inadequate intake. And we saw that in some states, like Chhattisgarh and Bihar, introducing wheat would have no or very limited reduction in inadequate intake, primarily because these states consume PDS rice. But in some states like Rajasthan and Uttar Pradesh, we see that fortifying wheat has this added benefit. Rajasthan in particular, where no rice is being consumed, or PDS rice is being consumed, and even in Uttar Pradesh, where there's a kind of mixture of wheat and rice, we see that fortifying the wheat as well, we have an added reduction with current standards from 23 to a 31% reduction. So this was just some examples that we've previously worked on in India, but I'll go through how we got to these conclusions and the overview of the methodology that we've used. So going back to the slide that Francis presented, there's lots of questions that we can answer using HCS data, and all of these can be disaggregated by geography and socioeconomic status. So, but how do we do this? We can process HCS into nutrition metrics for a parent intake measure. So as Francis said, you usually have a food consumption module within the HCS that asks households what do they consume over the past 7 days. So they'll be asked how much wheat, how much fish, any apples, green leafy veg. And this will be we then have the quantities, yes, but we don't have any information about individual micronutrients. So for this, we have to match each of the reported food items into, for example, how much iron is in the food items consumed. And we know that we can do this by using food composition tables that are publicly available for each country. And we can then work out through kind of simple maths how much iron is in the food that's consumed over the 7 days. We can then divide this by 7 to get a daily household intake. So we have this, the quantities consumed per household, which are then matched to the food composition data. We then want to look at comparing households to households, and households might have multiple family members. So we want to have a similar denominator to look at comparing all the households. So we want to look at a type of per capita measurement, but instead of doing per capita where you might have children who eat less or adults who eat more, we redistribute this based on energy requirements of the household. So based on the roster information we have in the HCES, we can calculate how much energy is required by the household based on the sex and age of each constituent member. And then we redistribute the total nutrient supply by this kind of weighted per capita. We call it the adult female equivalent, and it's based on methods that have previously been researched in the London School and others. So once we've redistributed the food, the nutrient intake from the household to using the adult female equivalent and have a measure, we can have this micronutrient intake that is estimated across the survey. We then want to look at the adequate intake, and we do this by comparing the micronutrient intake of the adult female equivalent and comparing it to a dietary reference value for an adult female. So we get the dietary reference values for each country that we're working in and compare the intake to this EAR, the estimated average requirement, or the dietary reference value of interest. And for that, we then calculate the risk of inadequate intake for each household. We can then also, based on the households reported consumption of, or the redistributed consumption of each food item, we can then look at coverage and quantity consumed of for example, rice and wheat, as we showed before. And then on top of this, when we have these two components of inadequate intake and consumption of specific food items, we can then model potential intervention scenarios for reducing the risk of inadequate intake. So we have a kind of framework for identifying appropriate interventions that require the identification of micronutrient shortfalls. So first, we have this access to population dietary intake through the HCS, which can be broken down nationally and subnationally. Once we've done this analysis on looking at inadequate intake, we can identify areas of elevated risk. So micronutrient shortfalls, which areas are, or which population groups have higher risk of iron intake, for example, inadequate iron intake. Then we have three avenues to go down. We can identify locally produced food sources of these micronutrients and promote greater year-round availability or access to these food. So more of a dietary-based approach. We can identify commonly consumed industrially processed foods as fortification vehicles and fortify these vehicles with necessary micronutrients. We can also identify targeted social assistance programs and advance nutrition components to increase the availability of these micronutrients. So as Francis said earlier, we know that HCS isn't. We don't want to say it's as good or better than other methods of micronutrient or nutrition surveys, but there are clear strengths of using these surveys for nutrition analysis. They are nationally and subnationally representative, so you can do quite granular analysis. You can break down by admin 1, sometimes even more granularly, depending on how representative the survey is. But we can also disaggregate by other variables that are collected by the household survey. So these are large economic surveys that have lots of variables that can be then stratified to look at different variables. So socioeconomic, for example, per capita expenditure. But also social protection enrollment is sometimes captured by these household consumption expenditure surveys. So you can look at what is the risk of inadequate intake for these certain groups that might be targeted, and then model interventions on top of that. Similar data is collected, enabling analysis from multiple countries. So in our project, we use this data very regularly, and we can very quickly replicate similar analyses in different countries, depending on the questions coming from the country offices. But because they are in a similar format, we can very quickly repeat and answer questions. But data is also collected across the year. So we capture seasonality of different food groups, different food items, and we can also compare inter-season about the risk of inadequate intake. But that's not to say there aren't any limitations. We have no information about the inter-household food distribution. So the adult female equivalent calculation that we do is a proxy to look at individual intake, but it's not individual intake as 24-hour recall would be. We have limited capture of food consumed outside of the house. Some HCES is trying to mitigate this, but we don't know exactly what would be consumed outside of the house based on the survey. And also the survey may overestimate foods that are purchased in bulk. So staple grains and salt, for example, may be overestimated. So that was a kind of brief overview of our a case study and the methods that we've used, but we have some resources that we've pulled together on the case study I just showed, but also some peer-reviewed articles about the methods and the process used. I think I'll pass back over to Francis for the practical session.
Great. Thank you for sticking with us so far. We thought we'd just get you talking for a few minutes before we go into our panel, and we've got time at the end for questions as well. But we know that we went through that quite fast. We tried to keep it high level because we are not sure how many people in the room are analysts or at the other end completely. But I think what we wanted to have you go away with, if you are an analyst and you've never used these data, I hope that maybe you would consider it in the future. And if you are interested, we're very happy to support people who want to do this type of analysis. There's a kind of informal network of people doing this type of analysis in the world. We're very keen to formalize, and we're very keen to sort of strengthen the capacity of others who do this. And then people who could be looking for something to fill evidence gaps in the shorter term, we're very happy to try and see how we could support this analysis to be done in your country, and ideally done by local institutions in your country as well. So there are a few resources, as Gabrielle said, on this link. We're here today and tomorrow, so happy to chat in more depth. But we just wanted to have a kind of quick chat with everybody here. If you could turn to your neighbor, or two neighbors if you're sitting in a group of three, we'd love you to think about one or two questions that you saw this and thought, oh, I wonder if I could answer this question in my country. We have a few examples here, but you don't have to follow them. We're going to give you just a few minutes to introduce yourself to your neighbor if you don't know each other, and share maybe one or two questions you thought maybe this could answer in my country. So I'll leave you there. Please don't be shy. There's momos downstairs if we finish early.
One more minute.
Yeah, I think you're good. Do you need more time? One more minute. It's good conversation. Okay, thank you so much. We were really worried that people wouldn't participate. So I'm going to ask you to cut short your wonderful discussions, and if we could have maybe one or two volunteers to share their question, to share any sort of idea that they came up that this is a question we have in our country that we would like answered. Yes, please. Okay.
Yeah. Hello. Hello, everyone. My name is Dipendra Bhatta. I have one question regarding the micronutrient supplementation and fortification. Is there any tools to measure the effectiveness of micronutrient supplementation? I mean, in Nepal, there has been started vitamin A supplementation from 1991, but what is the actual effectiveness of vitamin A? So I am asking this question. Any tool to measure the effectiveness of micronutrient supplementation? Thank you.
Great. And then maybe we'll take one more.
So we are looking at including the private sector in these health-related conversations. So one thing we were thinking about is if addressing micronutrient deficiency could affect in some ways productivity or some workplace outcomes. So then the private sector would be more interested in investing in these resources and maybe providing it for the workforce as well. Okay. So yeah, it's different from the social protection angle, but just thinking about it.
So sort of the impact on their own workforce.
Impact on their own workforce, so that they are incentivized to, provide it at a more firm level.
Food.
Yeah.
Okay. So great. One more, yeah.
Yeah. I'm Shajul Quraishi from Max Foundation, Bangladesh. In fact, we're always trying to go for food fortification. Why not in organic way, like fortified crops?
Yep.
Like variety of mazes that has so many nutritions. So why don't you think about that? We have already our Dr. Abed Chaudhry, who invented the Poncho Brihi. You all will maybe know that, and he also invented some sort of maize, variety of maize, and that has full of nutrition. So we can organically grow these kind of crops.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So I'm going to take that one last. That's the easy question. So we're supporting some work in Bangladesh right now with the Sun Academic Research Network and University of Dhaka. I think Dr. Nazma just popped out. And the first question there was about more nutritious rice varieties and whether we could include them in our modeling. And the answer is absolutely yes, because we have information about the foods households are consuming, and we make assumptions about their nutrient content. We match them to food composition information for that country, but there's no reason you couldn't match that to a different composition. It just depends a little bit on what your scenario would be. Would you like to, let's take the, I'm really sorry, I think it's called the Bangladesh Rice Research Institute. If you took their improved varieties of rice, would you make an assumption that everyone in a certain part of the country would suddenly eat that rice? Would you make it national? Would you put it in a social protection program? Anything like that, you can. Exactly. So that's very easy to model. And then what you could quickly get out of, once you have these data set up for a country, is an estimate of how much that could reduce the risk of inadequate intake of a micronutrient of choice. So it's quite, I wouldn't say it's easy, but it's, once you have the model set up, it's quite simple to do. We're quite keen, once somebody has set up a model, depending on the data sharing agreements, we might not be able to share the data, but we make all of our code public on GitHub. So somebody else could pick up that code, get access to the data, and run that model. Or if you're interested in Bangladesh, we're still finalizing our analysis plan, so we could have a chat on how to include that in our model. And we really want to show a more comprehensive set of modeling, not just individual interventions. The next question I'll take was micronutrient supplements. For multiple micronutrient supplements, iron, folic acid, anything that's given quite regularly to a kind of key individual, that's quite easy to model in. Vitamin A is a little bit more difficult because it's given it sort of, maybe 4 times across the year. So it's a little bit harder to make an assumption about this macro dose of vitamin A and how that sort of equates to a weekly diet. So maybe we have a cup of tea later and talk about that a bit more. It's the only one that is like, when you said it, I'm like, oh, that's the one we can't do. And then productivity. I think that it would be really interesting there to almost think about what would stimulate let's say the management of a company who has a lot of staff. What would, somebody used the word yesterday, lollipops, like what would the incentive be for them, and then work backwards for that. We do know that sometimes talking to policymakers or decision makers about iron intake, they're like, So what? What does that mean? We've been doing some work with the University of California, Davis, who convert these again into using the Lives Saved tool into sort of lives lost and lives saved through that type of analysis. I think a lot of the time as well, sort of using an economic lens and looking at, cost to GDP, or maybe it's cost of healthcare for you as a boss, how much your insurance premiums are per year. I think it would be, I don't think everything can be captured in this model, but I think it's about thinking inventively, what matters to these people? Is health of their staff enough, or is it some cost saving, and then kind of putting the steps together for that. So I'm going to stop there because I think it's a wonderful time to introduce Arvind's back to the stage and our panelists to talk a little bit more about how this is being used or could be used in countries. And just thank you so much for still being awake at this time.
Great. Thank you, Francis, and Gab for that wonderful overview. I think from your presentation, Francis, I think one of the important points about, we have various data options for nutrition decision making. And the other aspect which is very critical is that micronutrient surveys are quite expensive. And it is so opportune for the times that we are living in right now, where the global landscape for funding is becoming extremely challenging as well. We have to look at approaches in terms of how decision makers can utilize data that is available for decision making in the most best way possible. And with that, we can get into the segue to bring in the decision makers and also the people who are making it happen through their support and investments as well in this particular field as well. So I have the pleasure to invite Dr. Champika Vikramasinghe, who's the Deputy Director General with the Public Health Services 2 with the Ministry of Health, Government of Sri Lanka. And then Ruchika Sachdeva, she's the nutrition lead at Gates Foundation in India. Please welcome to the stage. We were supposed to have another representative from the government of Nepal as well, but unfortunately he had a medical emergency, so he couldn't make it. So yeah, we will continue with our panelists as well. So 1 second. Let me set up with my ingredients. As you get old, you need specs, you need all kinds of things, So So, one of the things which I just mentioned as well is that we did see in terms of, how the MIMI analysis, helps in the absence of, the data collection mechanisms in the country, such as micronutrient surveys. I talked about that as well. So we will see in terms of all these examples that we have looked into, in terms of how do we translate it and how that leads into policy action as well. Because this one thing is about collection of data, analyzing the data, presenting the data as well. But then if that does not translate into policy action, but then we are missing the point in terms of, how we take it to the next level as well. Because options are available. So in this discussion, we will try to find that out in terms of, how we take this forward in terms of policy action as well. So let me start with asking this question to you, Dr. Champika. Since you are a policymaker making decisions in Sri Lanka as well. So from a policy standpoint and considering the current data landscape, how could the evidence generation approaches shared in the MIMI analysis be used to address Sri Lanka's needs to integrate programs to address micronutrient deficiencies, such as large-scale food fortification and any other nutrition interventions that you're talking about in your country more effective?
Thank you very much for inviting me. In Sri Lanka, we don't have nationally representative micronutrient data, and not disaggregated by geography or by socio-demographic characteristics. So we have actually tried to do a large-scale micronutrient study, which is really expensive. So we are relying on this MIMI analysis. Now we have our household consumption and expenditure survey done. We are using that and validating those data with our census data, and also refining it with our monthly nutrition month data. So once we have these, now all our policy decisions are focusing on calories. So if we have this MIMI data, which is validated for the country, then we can have nutrition focused policy decisions. For example, now our staple food is rice, but there are many areas in our country where people exclusively eat wheat flour. And we have requested our companies to voluntarily fortify wheat flour with iron and folic acid. Now, if we have the MIMI data, which can be, geographically assessing the nutrient requirement of those areas, in that case, we can make a policy decision whether to make our wheat flour fortification mandatory, and also we can make regulations on that. The other one is now we have our midday meal program in our country. We normally say this much of calories, 2 vegetables and 1 egg, but we really don't know whether it is adequate, and it's only for primary classes. So once we have this data, we are awaiting the report, then we can decide whether that's adequate or whether we need to make some changes, and also based on various areas, whether we need to change the content of this midday meal. And you asked us about the fortification. We have started our iron fortification of rice, and we are using in 3 districts of our school midday meal program, and we are going to expand it to 5 more districts. Once we have, and Gates Foundation is actually helping us in doing the effectiveness study. Once we have that, and also MIMI data, we can make a decision whether nationally we can do our iron fortification of rice for the midday meal, and also whether the age groups of school children could be changed. And then, finally, we can decide whether, national iron fortification of rice is needed, and, then the private sector can come in and, get involved in the program. The other one is we have our Aswasuma nutrition, for poor people. We provide supplementation of food, and there we give a food basket. That one also, the contents of that, we can decide based on our micronutrient survey. If we know the nutrients lacking, then we can include them, and we can customize according to areas. So actually a lot of things could be done, and a lot of policy decisions could be taken if we have a well-validated micronutrient data.
Thank you so much, Dr. Champika, because what I understand is that you're talking about 3 distinct areas that I could identify, is that how we can improve the menu plan for the school feeding program, how we can basically redesign the food basket that you're providing through various social protection programs as well, and then also how do we use this data to scale up the existing programs as well. So that is a very concrete example in terms of how we can take this data analytics part into the next level in terms of policy action and implementation as well. To you, Ruchika, as a donor, what kind of evidence or support do you look for, especially considering the robust data analysis and case studies that was shared in the MIMI session, when you're deciding to invest in nutritional adequacy of diets, if you can highlight?
Yeah, thank you so much, Arvind, and thank you for inviting for this very important discussion. So from the foundation, I think one key thing which is really important for the foundation is we work on, country-led priorities. So that's really important. also for us it's really important to look at robust country specific needs and impact potential. And we really kind of follow a pyramid when it comes to nutrient inadequacies. So look at what is the consumption. So what are the nationally available consumption data available? Then what are the micronutrient deficiencies available, both macro and micro. Look at then country specific consumption data available, and then look at, when we are talking about coverage, one is from the food, the other is, if there are gaps in food, what are the fortification or supplementation program, what is the coverage, what is also in terms of, are the vehicles which are fortified, they are fortified as per standards or not. So that becomes really important. If they are not fortified as per standards, we will not see an impact. And then we look at an impact evaluation. So we really look at, one is the efficacy and effectiveness evidence, but then also look at what is the data available. And I think rightly pointed out the work which has been done by MIMI. Similar work also we kick-started last year with Indian Statistical Institute in India, which was again looking at the household consumption expenditure survey and also intersecting with MIMI, to look at how we can look at adult female equivalent, but also then going beyond and look at, taking energy as a basis at a household level, what are the gaps when it comes to micronutrient inadequacy, and then how this can inform a policy action. What we also look at is innovation. So one is, impact and modeling, and what, Mimi presented. So that's one kind of innovation where the data gaps are, because I think all of us will agree that the 24-hour recall, which is considered as a standard, gold standard, or the biomarker-led micronutrient deficiencies, these are expensive. Mostly the countries are conducting this 5 to 10 years, and that's a longer period. So how we can use innovative, low-cost innovations to look at more frequent data. So one kind of innovation which, we are really honored to partner is what MIMI is doing. But the other piece which we are also looking at it, and we launched last year, is this micronutrient biomarker initiative, where we are also looking at how the countries are collecting data when it comes to infectious disease, public health surveillance. So how remnant samples could be used to kind of look at and use innovative methods like point of care. A lot of work is now happening on point of care like Consus. In India, we are working with the CHIRA, who's looking at multiplexes for micronutrient deficiencies, again as point of care. There is some work which has been done by Cornell on anemia phone, which is a ferritin point of care. So how these point of cares could also be used and layered to the existing surveillance data to kind of give more regular data in terms of micronutrient deficiencies. So case in example is Uganda, which looked at the HIV data, and they looked at the dried blood spots, and they looked at, and that threw good light in terms of the iron deficiency and vitamin A, which informed policy action. So we are looking at such innovations both in terms of the diagnostic size, but also in terms of how the existing surveillance platforms can be used to collect more frequent data to inform policy action.
No, thank you so much, Ruchika, for that elaborate response in terms of the length and breadth of activities that the foundation is focusing, and specifically looking at effectiveness, impact, and looking at how data can be better utilized for informing program decisions as well. And I was particularly impressed with the fact that the foundation's focus on innovation. And the point you talked about, point of care and nutrition diagnostics, this is an area which is certainly an untapped potential. And we are very glad to note that the foundation, as always, has been the front runner in terms of trying to identify this area as an important area of focus, because then that also directly feeds into the whole MIMI and nutrition analytical piece of work as well. Just as a follow-up, Dr. Champika. So now we listen to all the discussions and how you're planning to move forward as well. But all these things don't come without its challenges, right? I mean, everything you do in life, there are challenges which you face. So if I were to ask you in terms of what is the challenge that you face in terms of both informing these policy actions within your colleagues, within different ministries, or informing this policy action, because at the end of the day, it is a political executive decision that has to be made in terms of how we move this forward. So if you could highlight briefly in terms of what are the challenges, because it's important for the audience and us to also understand in terms of the policymakers side of things as well, is in terms of, we come up with these ideas, but many a times policymakers have their own challenges as well, because having worked in the government myself, I know what kind of things happen behind the scenes as well. So if you can elaborate in terms of challenges that you foresee in terms of policy action.
Yes, these days the main challenge I'm facing is about this iron fortification of rice, because our Prime Minister is the Minister of Education, and she has very clearly said, if anything happens after iron fortification, it is your responsibility. So I have to ensure that when we make that decision to nationwide iron fortification of rice for the midday meal, it is safe. And now actually Gates Foundation has come up with the effectiveness study. There is not enough time to do an impact survey, because it will take a long time to see the impact in our pilot areas. So we are going to take, low-hanging fruits like maybe iron deficiency, anemia status, or the ferritin levels, and then make our decision whether it is necessary. And MIMI data will definitely help us to show that, what are the areas in which we have these deficiencies. Then we can say for sure these areas really need the intervention, and also the intervention is effective. So that is one main challenge we are facing. And the other thing is we have to think about the cost considerations. At the beginning everything comes free, but then we have to buy everything. Mm-hmm. And we are doing, not so good economically also. So we have to actually cost our interventions and make the decision with so many priorities involved. What is our right priority at this time?
Sure. No, thank you. Yeah, I've also come to you as well on that one.
But can I
just, sure.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Champika, in bringing that out. And what would really help, as you kind of pointed out in a low-hanging fruit, is in terms of the safety, is from MIMI, which will really, I think, very quick, is in terms of what diets people are having, and also, unfortunately, the recent, cyclone and the impact it will have in terms of the intake, again brings the importance of ensuring nutrient adequacy. But what MIMI could also help is in terms of what is the current gap, and then how in the school feeding program, which I understand it's giving 5 to 7 milligram of iron, it'll help bridge the gap. But also my understanding would be, given iron metabolism is really tightly regulated, the absorption happens as per the requirement. So if the person has deficiency, the absorption will be more. If the person doesn't have deficiency, the absorption will be less. So with 5 to 7 milligram of iron for a child, and the diets, the upper tolerable limit is 45 milligrams. So my assumption, broadly, is it's really far off in terms of being the risk. But I think quickly we could kind of get that data from MIMI. So just wanted to mention that, which you could also then inform the policy, people also.
I also want to add to that. We have certain areas where we have thalassemia. So people are a bit concerned, adding iron may add some, burden to those children. That's one area. And now, if MIMI shows iron deficiency is there in those areas, then it is justified. If it's not there, then we may be adding more iron to them.
No.
Yeah. Sorry, just wanted to respond. Yeah, so another piece, because this was the experience also coming from in India as well, that similar concern. So again, the quantity of iron which is added to fortified foods would be the similar equivalent if we are eating, animal source food. So, to say a meat or a fish or a chicken, which anyways a person has that requirement. And these are, specific. So who are thalassemia major, they are being given, iron chelating kind of medicines. So even there is scientific evidence, and there was a review committee which was set in India, which looked at all the evidence. So happy to share that for further deliberation at Sri Lanka level also.
I think yeah. So this was a bit of a technical deep dive into the session, but nevertheless good to know that as well. But I think Dr. Champika, the point that you brought about was two things, distinct things. Is one is that cost considerations as well. Many countries do not have the kind of fiscal space, and I have no hesitation in saying MIMI type analysis are exactly the kind of things to actually address those cost considerations and fiscal space, lack of fiscal space, because micronutrient surveys and large sample biomarker data collection systems cost a lot of money. If many countries in the region are struggling to do that as well. And the second aspect, which clearly goes to show your leadership as well, and many leaders within the government systems as well, ultimately sometimes these policy actions come down to individual risk-taking as well, where the ball is in your court and you're supposed to take those decisions and nobody else to back you up as well. But kudos to you and leaders like you in many country contexts as well, who take that risk and take that decision and make this happen as well. So we're very happy about that. So Ruchika, for you, you deal with governments day in and day out, with partners day in and day out, with lots of expectations and other things. So if I were to ask you one main challenge, just one, in terms of that you see in terms of policy action or policy translation of these data-driven systems and data analytics, what would that one challenge be that you face?
So I think what is really important is looking at a bigger picture, and when we are dealing with multiple stakeholders, they are always thinking about what is in for them. So how we kind of orchestrate that partnership to kind of showcase that we are looking at a larger goal and impact, and what is in for that stakeholder. With government, it's really important, and what creates a noise is when technical experts are not talking in one language, because they don't understand science. And if there's a noise in terms of different voices coming from the technical folks, that confuses them. So one thing which is really important is evidence-based kind of data sharing, and also which is in a simpler digestible form for them, and how we can also ensure cohesion and encourage, there are multiple voices, but then the evidence-based discussions happen, which are then communicated to policymakers.
Sure. Thank you so much, Ruchika. That was a very good point in terms of policy cohesion, because many a times we are driven by our individual project realities and organizational mandates as well. But it is important that at the end, when we are discussing policy actions, we speak in one voice. And we have good examples like the Post-it Network and others in India as well. So in conclusion, if I were to ask Dr. Champika one action item that you would implement going back from this D4N conference as well to make, to translate the data analytics into action, what that action item would be?
Well, we need to see the MIMI report, and based on that, we have to make a decision on the fortification.
Great. Ruchika, the same question to you.
Yeah, so
One action. One.
Yeah. So something which we have started, but doubling down our effort is, from the foundation, it's really important to make things, global good, so they are freely available. So there's a lot of potential in cross-sharing in Global South, and there are a lot of good practices happening within the country. So how we can, and again, doubling down efforts is cross-sharing of challenges, opportunities, best practices when it comes to methodology, large surveys, and how countries can cross-share to speed track, impact at the ground level and for the ones who need it the most.
Sure, great. Thank you so much. So in conclusion, what we are hearing is that clear messages is that MIMI analysis is not just a diagnostic tool, but it's a lens that helps country identify precisely where micronutrient gaps are and which interventions can close them most effectively, be it fortification expanding the food basket or making the food assistance nutritionally adequate as well. With that, thank you so much for your insights as well. We have a few minutes for questions, audience questions as well. So let's pass on the mic to the audience as well if they have any questions for the panelists or generally about the session as well. I think we have about 5 minutes or 10 minutes. Yeah. Maybe we can take 3 questions. Yeah. Oh, one online. Yeah.
We had one question online about whether there's a micronutrient survey conducted in Sri Lanka in 2022. No, we didn't think so. But yeah, here we go.
Any other questions?
So what is the content of that food basket you are planning to, or you have already started that? Yes.
Yeah. That is for the family. So they have certain amount of rice and vegetables, pulses, eggs and things are planned, but we can customize it based on the needs of the area. For a certain amount of money, for a week's supply is provided.
Thank you. I think this is rather a question for you, Francis. So, micronutrient intake through different forms, whether fortification or through different means, is there any specific window of opportunity? Previously, we used to talk about the first 1,000 days, and then now we are up to 8,000 days. And now we're also talking about the school meals program. So if we provide a micronutrients through different means, is there like a specific window of opportunity for the micronutrients to make a difference in terms of the micronutrient deficiency?
That's a good question. I think if I stand here, I won't have my back to anyone. Just have lights in my eyes. I think that they build upon each other. So we can't kind of ignore the first 1,000 days. We can't, by focusing, I think that there's this narrative now about the 8,000 or the 10,000 days. What I don't want that to happen, I think most people say the same, don't kind of discredit the importance of the first 1,000 days. You first have to get the first 1,000 days right, because any damage, any sort of stunting, anything that happens there, often it's irreversible. So that's your first investment. You've built that block, but you can't drop the ball then. You also have to keep that going. And then, I mean, I think then it comes into a different argument about equity. You sort of have the first, sort of the 8,000 days, and then what happens? Do you just drop children and then maybe pick it up again once you have an adolescent girl or a woman of reproductive age, and then boys are forgotten about? I think there's an equity angle there. Maybe it's not as important in terms of micronutrients, but it is important in terms of well-being and human rights. And then also, their contribution to a society. If somebody is not well nourished, if they're not well, they're not going to be able to produce for their own family. They're not going to be able to produce for the economy, depending on what lens you look for. So I think the first 1,000 days needs to be safeguarded, but you then don't stop. That makes sense. I don't know if anyone else wants to add there.
So just building on, given we are also in an era where, infectious disease with, what we saw with COVID and inflammations. So, and I think all of us are aware when there are infections, one is if a person is micronutrient deficient, the response, so one is vulnerable, so it's bidirectional. So it's a vicious circle. So susceptibility to infection increases because there is vitamin A, C, E, a lot of micronutrients which are important for immunity, zinc. So if one is deficient, then more susceptible to infection, and if there are infections, then also, if you talk about TB, but others as well, or HIV or others, then, the response to the treatment also gets, or recovery also get affected. So I think at each stage of life and for all, micronutrients are key because they can't be made in the body, and we need to have it from diet. So, of course, first 1,000 days are important, and the point of equity, because, if you look at India, 25% are anemic, even men or boys are anemic. So, for all it's important, but then, if the resources are limited, then you really have to see where to focus on.
Yes, exactly.
Can I also talk about that? Now, all this time we were talking about the girls and then the mothers, and also it's time we talk about the men's health also, because in our country, normally a wife lives more than 12, 15 years than the husband. And also, if we take NCDs, it's mainly seen in males. So it's time, we consider the nutrition of the adolescent man and all, boy, and also look after them also.
Great, yeah. Any other questions? If not, then I think we can close before time. I think we still have 4 minutes of our lives back. So thank you so much, the panelists, and thank you for your attention. I hope you enjoyed this discussion as well. I know it's not the best time of the day, but still, thank you so much for your attention, and thank you, the panelists, and thank you for all of us.